Hello and welcome to Shades of Murder. In this podcast, I share and discuss tales of true crime from around the world and throughout history. In each episode, I present to you a case or story of murder, and I delve deep into its many layers. I trust that you will learn something new and intriguing every episode. Please be forewarned that each episode contains specific and at times very graphic and disturbing details of the case and may not be intended for all audiences. This is a special warning for those who may be extra sensitive to harm caused to children. This is a very brutal case, but it is important to know. It is a dark truth that the world's most marginalized people are not treated equally. When someone from a marginalized group is the victim of a crime, too often they are ignored, neglected, and mistreated by both law enforcement and the media. What does it say about a society when these victims include the most innocent of them all? What happens when the people whose primary purpose is to serve and protect don't care enough to help prevent the most horrific and brutal of crimes? This is the case of the children of Nithari Village, India. Located in western Uttar Pradesh, India, is the city of Noida, a planned community known for its beautiful temples, extravagant bazaars, decadent shopping malls, and bird sanctuary. Within this planned city also lies Nithari Village, which is overflowing with impoverished migrant workers who do everything possible to live their best lives in the slums. Amongst the dusty desert streets of the village, several generations squeeze into small bungalows and huts made of straw, mud, and even tin. Unlike a traditional Indian family, most women have no other option but to pursue menial work during the day to help make ends meet. This leaves their children running around, riding bikes, and playing with their friends without any adults watching them. They weren't completely alone, though. The community watched out for one another, and there were no real issues of crime or conflict until one day in March of 2005, when a child disappeared. Then another child went missing shortly after that. Then another, and another. They had all last been seen along the same stretch of desolated desert road. Then the children vanished without a trace. Desperate mothers and fathers did their best to get the local police to help them and attempted to file complaints. But the truth was that no one cared enough about the well-being of migrant children to spend any time or resources searching for them. There was some talk in the nicer parts of nearby Noida about how terrible it was that so many children had disappeared from Nithari Village. However, most people in Noida were more concerned with their new phones, the latest styles available in the shopping malls, and what brand of motor scooters so-and-so were riding. They simply could not relate to the migrant families living in these slums or care enough to do anything about it. And so 2005 turned into 2006, and by the next year, 38 children as young as 3 years old and as old as 14 had vanished from the same eerie stretch of desert road. Then one cold winter day on December 29th, 2006, in one of the wealthiest suburbs of Noida, which was adjacent to the slums of Nithari Village, someone came across a startling discovery. Lying in the sewer in front of one of the nicest homes were pieces of children's clothing and body parts. There were 8 skeletal remains, and their size indicated that they were likely from children. Even then, local law enforcement did not take the findings very seriously. The parents and loved ones of the missing children would not stay hushed or ignored any longer. The courts would finally take the incentive and form a special police force to determine what had happened to the children who had disappeared and who was responsible for the dumping of the clothing and body parts. The skeletal remains and clothing had been discovered in front of the house of a wealthy local businessman named Moninder Singh Pander. Instead of going after him directly, the police began to track the movements of Surinder Kohli, his servant, who resided within the home. Local law enforcement had decided that Surinder Kohli was the perpetrator and pulled him in for questioning. There is no information as to what tactics may have been used or how long Surinder Kohli was interrogated, but I would imagine the interrogation would have been intense, long, and brutal. The police had done absolutely nothing for almost 2 years as 38 children disappeared, even though their families had pleaded, begging for their help. Now that the news had broken about the fragments of children's clothing and skeletal remains being found in a sewer, the entire community became involved, and they were disgusted and outraged. Very affluent and powerful families of Noida demanded answers and that someone pay for these crimes. At the end of their primary suspect's questioning, Surinder Kohli had confessed to murder. Surinder Kohli told the investigators how he had lured away and killed a young missing girl. Afterward, he chopped up her body into small pieces and threw her head and slippers into the enclosed gallery, which is essentially a storm drain, behind his employer Pander's home. Kohli instructed the police as to where he would find the girl's remains. When the investigators began to dig up the gallery, they discovered 14 more skulls. The children's skeletal body parts were found hidden within bags. The investigation into serial homicide was now handed over to the CBI, which is India's version of the FBI, the top-rated and most elite investigative agency in India. Now that the murders involved a well-known businessman from the upper class, law enforcement was more than willing to spend time figuring out what had happened to these poor little children. During the investigation, the horrific sequence of events and modus operandi of the perpetrators was revealed. What would be known as the exact nightmare scenario, most of us as small children are warned about by our parents, could happen to us if we talk to strangers, happened to these innocent little children. Allegedly, according to the confession taken by the police, Surinder Kohli would lure the little boys and girls with a piece of chocolate or toffee and abduct them. These kids were extremely impoverished, so something as small as a piece of chocolate or candy would have been a taste of luxury for them. They probably got a sweet on their birthday or a holiday, but they certainly were not privileged enough to be spoiled on an ordinary day with one. It was this sense of innocence and their lack of visibility in the greater community that made them prime targets for these twisted, sick men, not just once or twice, but over 30 times. Surinder Kohli explained how he would deliver the children then to his employer Moninder Singh Pander's house, where allegedly both men sexually assaulted the children. Surinder Kohli was the one to kill them and dismember their bodies. It is not known what method was used to murder all of these children, but it is believed that most were killed by strangulation. The CBI claimed that Surinder Kohli also admitted to participating in acts of necrophilia and cannibalism with some of his victims. However, during his trial, Surinder Kohli would retract his confession, claiming that it was only the extreme duress of being beaten by officers that he made such extreme claims. Soon after, Moninder Singh Pander would also be brought into custody. It was concluded that the serial killers had abducted, raped, murdered, and dismembered at least 19 young women and children, most of them under the age of 14 years old, and almost all of them female. The agency filed 16 formal charges of murder. Moninder Singh Pandey was initially only charged with immoral trafficking in one case, but would later face rape and murder charges in several others. The national government could not deny how local law enforcement had completely disregarded the concerns of the parents of these missing children, who would likely become the victims of the most evil and horrible of crimes. Some parents had claimed their children had been taken 2 years earlier, but the local police ignored their cries to help find their missing kids. During this time, organizations like India's National Commission for Women were proactive in working to help locate the daughters of 6 of these families, whom local law enforcement had refused to investigate. Unfortunately, nothing ever led to finding the missing children. The national government opened an investigation into local law enforcement's neglect and failure to help find these missing children. Only 2 days later, 2 beat constables, which would be the equivalent of beat patrol cops in the United States, were suspended from duty. Hundreds of outraged residents from Nithari marched in protest to the street where the children's remains were found. Their anger and sadness boiled over. They pushed past the officers who guarded what the press had now coined the House of Horrors. Some protesters even broke in and threw stones at the neighboring homes. I presume they did this as an expression of anger and frustration for the neighbors not noticing anything strange about children randomly appearing there who were never seen again. There were barricades set up near the house. The relatives of the murdered children and young women were amongst the protesters, waiting for any new information to arrive. Parents whose children were still missing came to the site, hoping to determine if one of the still unidentified victims could be theirs. Vandana Sakar was a struggling and hardworking mother whose 20-year-old daughter, Pinky, disappeared one day. When she turned to the local police for help, they asked her, and I quote, "Why do you people have so many children if you can't look after them?" When she showed the officers a photo of her daughter, they said she was very beautiful and that she probably just ran off with some guy and got married. 12 of the skulls discovered were from children, and 5 were from adult victims. 13 were identified very soon after. Vandana Sakar's daughter Pinky was amongst them. The grim ending that Mrs. Sakar's daughter met was revealed when the yellow suit and hairpin she had been wearing the day she was last seen walking to work was found. It was inside a bag in the sewer, along with other parts of her dismembered body. The investigation would later reveal the young women who had been murdered were all involved in domestic help and had been presented with the opportunity to work at Moninder Singh Pandey's house. The state government attempted to appease and calm the voices of some parents whose children were never looked for. Mrs. Sakar and her husband were given 500,000 rupees, which was approximately $11,300, to compensate for her loss. In response to what she perceived as a buyout, Mrs. Sakar told the press, "My child's life is worth more than this. It's as if they want us to keep quiet. But I'm not going to remain silent." Dayavati, a woman who resided in a nearby slum, arrived to the site holding a black and white passport photo of her 16-year-old son, Vipin. Vipin had disappeared 4 months earlier. She told reporters that when she went to the police for help, they instructed her to look for him herself. As she said to the press, and I quote, "Things would have been different if I'd been rich. Then I could have bribed them to make them investigate." Other parents who reported their children missing were dismissed by the police, who even had the gall to claim they were just drunk troublemakers. Some were even flat out denied registering their complaints for their missing children. I don't understand how that is legal, but it is beyond unethical. These men should have been held criminally liable for this abuse of power. At least now, it had become widespread news that the local police were not interested in helping search for missing children or young adults, unless it benefited them. On January 3, 2007, the Uttar Pradesh government decided that due to the gross neglect shown by the hands of local police, they needed to make more than a statement. They needed to act if they were ever to win back the people's trust. The government suspended the former Senior Superintendent of Police, or the SSP, and the Superintendent of Police, SP, and an additional 6 sub-inspectors were fired from their positions. Why would the local police ignore the desperate cries for help from parents of missing children? The status of the families of these children were of the lowest caste. That is, the people of Nithari Village were the most impoverished and most marginalized of the community. They were not just poor migrant workers, but they had migrated from Bihar and West Bengal, considering one of, if not the lowest, socioeconomic castes. Within a walk of only 30 seconds, one crosses from the impoverished and forgotten over to the elite and affluent of Noida. That close is the line between those who live in mud huts, houses crafted of straw, and some residing even in shacks concocted of plastic sheeting and tin. Large families all share one bed, if they are lucky enough to have one. Amongst this inconceivable level of poverty, they breathe in the foul, toxic air of the nearby dump, where the cows and pigs go to forage. Beyond the open sewer of this village sits a makeshift bridge of metal piping, where one can view rows of trees that sprinkle the street. The residents of these homes are very wealthy and privileged. Their houses, inside and out, are luxurious and decadent. Many have elaborate architectural designs with marble in the front, huge arched windows, and iron-railed verandas. They often have high gated entrances, and some even have their own guards. Two vastly different life experiences exist within 30 seconds of one another. We have seen the similar treatment of the poorer socioeconomic classes and other marginalized groups of people in this country by both law enforcement and the media. There is a reason that most cases covered in true crime podcasts and documentaries center around white, in particular white middle to upper class women and men. It is not because these particular mediums care about these individuals or cases more, but with little to no information that has been provided by the media in its initial case, thanks in large part due to the lack of concern shown by the police. It can make it very challenging to cover stories of the marginalized. So much of this stems from the fact that society does not want to be burdened by the problems of others unlike them, because since the majority of the status quo can't relate to them, and they are very different, even polar life experiences, it makes it easier for some to just not hear about it. Many individuals in our society don't want to feel uncomfortable about how their privileged race or class is given more law enforcement protection and resources, which directly impacts the attention given by the media. This is an ugly truth that a lot of people would rather not acknowledge. This emotional and psychological detachment from marginalized groups of people only serves to justify the prioritization made by the criminal justice system as a whole, and the media towards those who fit a certain look and class. India is no better than the United States and countless other countries in this respect. The rich, the beautiful, the powerful, and the famous are almost always deemed top priority in what cases are investigated and what stories are covered. It was reported that when a 3-year-old boy of an executive went missing near his home in Noida, the police immediately prioritized looking for the child, and it was instant headline news all over the country. Law enforcement launched a widespread search for the boy, located the son's abductors, and returned the child safely home. We see this kind of nonsense play out time and time again in the media today. Thanks in part to true crime platforms and other social media outlets, our society has made some progress in highlighting missing persons and homicide cases of marginalized groups. I think what was so shocking to the community of Noida and the entire country of India and the world is that most of these victims were babies. They were just little kids and they were not searched for at all. Only 19 of them, which is roughly half of the missing children and young women, were ever written in an official complaint, showing the extent of how little they were valued. Not only were these victims and their loved ones of the lowest socioeconomic caste, but they were predominantly female. It would be unfair and irresponsible for me not to discuss this case through the lens of the patriarchy in India and how females are way less valued than males. I do not doubt that this also played a role into the police's lack of concern for the missing children and young women, since for some in India, girls and women are unwanted. This is not to be judgmental toward traditional Indian culture, and I'm sure in some regards, women are highly respected and honored. However, the facts show that females still suffer today from great gender inequality, and they are considered less important than males in society. India ranks 139th in the worst nations for work opportunities and participation for females in the workforce. They also rank this low in health and mortality rates. For education, they rank 118th, which is at the bottom third in the world. Studies show that girls die at birth or when they are young at much higher rates than boys do. This may be because India prefers to have sons. A report by Chief Economic Advisor Arvind Subramanian demonstrated that 55% of couples in India will continue to have children until they reach their goal of having a son. Between infanticide, which is the murder of infants, sex selection operations, and the much higher mortality rates of females, the extra girls having been born offset the attempts to achieve a male child. The female to male ratio in India is one of the most off-balanced in the world. I don't think it's a coincidence that most of the children and young people who were missing happened to be of the less valued gender. That they were poor females made them that much more disposable. Since the mothers and other females were the main family members asking the police for help, this would have made the police even less likely to care. A little over 2 years later, on February 13, 2009, both defendants, Surinder Kohli and Moninder Singh Pander, were found guilty and later sentenced to death in the first Nithari case for the rape and murder of 14-year-old Rimpa Haldar. Pander would later be acquitted of this crime. But for Surinder Kohli, it was only the beginning of a mind-spinning amount of convictions. On May 12, 2010, he was given a second death sentence for the abduction, rape, and murder of an 8-year-old girl. Then he was awarded a third death penalty in September of that same year for the same charges committed against a 9-year-old. He received a fourth death sentence for the death of a 12-year-old girl that December. 2 more years passed, and the investigation led to a 5th case, which handed him a 5th death sentence for the murder of a 5-year-old girl. 4 years later, on October 7, 2016, Surinder Kohli was found guilty once again and sentenced to death for the 6th time in the murder of a 25-year-old domestic servant. A few months later, another death sentence in the case of a 12-year-old girl. The investigation continued to reveal more evidence linking them to the abduction, rape, murder, and dismemberment of more innocent young victims. On July 22, 2017, Moninder Singh Pender was once again faced with charges in connection with the Grizzly Sierra murders. Both men were given the death sentence for the murder of Pinky Sarkar, the 20-year-old daughter of Vandana Sarkar. Another death sentence was awarded to both defendants on December 8, 2017, for the murder of a 25-year-old domestic helper. Then on March 2, 2019, a 10th death penalty was awarded to Surinder Kohli for the killing of a 14-year-old, and an 11th one he received for the killing of a 10-year-old the following month. As recently as January 16, 2021, Surinder Kohli was given a 12th death sentence for the murder of another 20-year-old woman. Then, in a twist of the courts, on March 26, 2021, Surinder Kohli was acquitted for the first time out of 13 cases, which involved the death of a 10-year-old girl. This is 12 death sentences for one person. I know there have been a few exceptions to this number in history, but this has to be up there with the record amount of death sentences one defendant has been awarded. I went down a bit of a rabbit hole, one could say, while researching criminal law in India. It was important to know the differences in their criminal justice system and what crimes warrant the death sentence. I am also a huge criminal law nerd, so learning about the differences and similarities in law between countries is fascinating to me. For the matter of time and interest in this discussion, I will do my best to keep my findings brief. India is one of 78 countries in the world that have retained the right to sentence a defendant to death for what has been recorded by the Supreme Court of India to be the rarest of cases. These include the following 5 categories of criminal circumstances. First is the manner of the commission of the murder, which involves the level of brutality the victim suffered. Secondly, there is the motive or intent, such as if someone murders someone to inherit land or hires someone to assassinate the person. The third is if the crime is antisocial or socially deplorable in its nature. This involves the murder of someone of a scheduled caste, which is an officially recognized group of people who are often the most socioeconomic disadvantaged members of society, like the residents of Nithari Village, or another member of a minority group who's intentionally killed to incite rage in the community. This sounds similar to the concept of how a hate crime in the United States is an aggravating factor in sentencing. Fourth is the magnitude of the crime, which is the category where serial killers and mass murderers would fall under. The fifth category encompasses the personality of the victim of murder, such as if they have a disability, a handicap, their age, or are incapacitated in some respect. Under the Indian Penal Code of 1860, there are several crimes committed by an offender that may make them eligible to receive the death penalty. The most prominent one being waging war against the country, or an attempt to do so. It can also be rewarded for the abetment of mutiny. Abetting mutiny is when a person encourages or assists someone within the military forces to commit an illegal or wrong act, or they seduce or persuade them in some way to abandon their duty. The third crime I found to be quite interesting. If someone is proven to have fabricated evidence intending to obtain a capital conviction against an individual, they can face the punishment of death. Now imagine if this crime was punishable by the death penalty or even by life imprisonment. How many law enforcement officers, prosecutors, crime lab analysts, and even everyday people could be put to death for making up or falsifying evidence in the United States? I think the unethical treatment or fabrication of evidence should be considered a much harsher crime in the United States. If the punishment were to be avoided at all costs, then perhaps our criminal and judicial system would be less corrupt, or at least a little. For some context, the current punishment for this offense in the United States, if proven by a criminal court, mind you, this law excludes prosecutors since they are beyond prosecution in such matters, is the maximum penalty of 1 to 5 years in prison. The fourth crime an individual could commit, making them eligible for the death penalty, is murder, of course. The fifth is very interesting as it involves the assistance or support of suicide in an individual younger than 18 years old or someone who is intellectually challenged. Kidnapping is also an offense for which someone can be penalized to death, in particular if the purpose is for ransom or with the intention to cause harm or death. In 2013, 3 more crimes were added to this list of death penalty warrantable acts. The Criminal Law Act of 2013 expanded these offenses to include rape, which results in the death or vegetated state of the victim, serial rapists, and armed robbery, which leads to murder. Many of these offenses resemble what we would identify as felony murder crimes, when the commission of one felony leads to the intentional or unintentional death of the victim. Then all individuals involved in the original felony could face the death penalty. Another crime which is unique to Hindu culture is the act of sati. This was once a historical practice in some Hindu communities, where when the husband died, the wife willingly burned herself or was thrown on top of the funeral pyre by other members as a sign of forever loyalty to the husband and the ending of the marriage. This ritual suicide is strictly forbidden in India and has been punishable by death since the Commission of Sati Prevention Act of 1987. This next one is completely insane and unjustified that it is allowed to be practiced anywhere in the world. It is shocking, but in India and many other Asian countries, if a person is proven to have been involved in the production, sale, or financial backing for certain amounts of narcotics and psychoactive drugs, they could be put to death. Based on the crimes the defendants were found guilty of, it seems like an obvious choice that both men would have received the death sentence for the beyond horrific acts that were planned and committed against the most innocent of victims. The death penalty in India is handed down more often than the sentence is executed. Similar to the criminal justice system in the United States, the convicted individual is given multiple opportunities to challenge their conviction. In 2014, after being denied his appeal, Surinder Kohli, along with 5 other death row prisoners, submitted mercy petitions, which is similar to a pardon in the United States. In India, the president has the power to grant pardons, respites, reprieves, or remissions of punishment, or to suspend, remit, or commute the sentence of any prisoner, no matter their offense. All of their mercy petitions were rejected. On September 8, 2014, Surinder Kohli's execution was stayed and was expected to be resumed on September 12th, but it never happened, and he kept receiving extensions. On October 29th of that year, the Supreme Court rejected the death sentence review petition submitted by Surinder Kohli's lawyer, citing that the court had not erred in judgment. Then his fate went into an entirely new direction when a division bench decided that upholding Surinder Kohli's execution would be, and I quote, unconstitutional in view of the inordinate delay. I found this to be so interesting because I'm sure many of you listeners are aware how the appellate process can go on for decades. And there have been prisoners on death row in our country for even longer. Imagine if this law existed in the United States, how many serial killers, mass murderers, and other infamously depraved individuals would have their death sentences commuted. As it is, most individuals on death row in the United States are never executed. Between the appeals and habeas corpus process, organizations intervening, the ethical issues surrounding what methods are most humane, and many states that have a moratorium, which is a pause on the death penalty. I mean, at this point, unless you live in Texas, Alabama, or Arizona, and a few other states that have executed prisoners in recent years, receiving the death penalty is more like a symbolic punishment. To some extent, since it does give an offender the automatic right to appeal. One could say that it is more beneficial to receive the death sentence than life imprisonment with no chance of parole. Of course, depending on the state you live in. This unexpected development in Surinder Kohli's sentence was in direct response to a public interest litigation, or a PIL, that was submitted by the NGO People's Union for Democratic Rights, or the PUDR. The group claimed that his stay of execution of 3 years and 3 months violated the Constitution. Then, in one of the most shocking and controversial outcomes in criminal justice history, and absolutely the most notorious of cases in India, the high courts changed their decision. In 2023, prisoners Surinder Kohli and Moninder Singh Pandher had their convictions overturned and were acquitted of all charges. Surinder Kohli, who had been given the death sentence for 12 murder convictions, was set free by the Allahabad High Court. Moninder Singh Pandher had been found guilty of rape and murder in 2 of the 12 cases and had also been awarded the death penalty. Both men were freed without any parole or probation parameters or restrictions set on their liberties of any kind. As to what were the reasonings behind the acquittal, the court cited a lack of evidence, tunnel vision on the part of the local police, and a poor investigation from the start. The High Court, which included a bench of 2 justices, Ashwani Kumar Mishra and Syed Aftab Hussain Rizvi, stated that the manner in which the Nithari killings and their subsequent investigation were handled was a disgrace to criminal justice. The entire case of the prosecution rested on the confession of the primary accused suspect, Surinder Kohli, who later claimed that his confessions, in particular the gory and vile details around his crimes, were being out of him. The court pointed out how the efforts made to conduct a thorough and proper investigation were minimal at best, full of bias, tunnel vision, and corruption. This would not be all surprising, given how they completely failed these victims and their loved ones when they ignored their having gone missing for 2 years. It would not be a stretch to think that they wanted this case wrapped up quickly and simply as possible. They found a viable suspect who conveniently happened to live in the house where the sewer was located. The main suspect was also a poor, uneducated man who was likely easy to intimidate and manipulate. I am not saying that I believe Surinder Kohli or Moninder Singh Pandher are innocent. What I am saying is that time and time again, we have seen cases where police and the prosecution decide who the offender is and make the evidence fit the narrative. In the United States alone, there have been people, mainly individuals of color and those of lower socioeconomic classes, who have been thrown into prison with little to no evidence against them, and many who face the death penalty because law enforcement and the prosecution decided that they had the right offender, and looking into other possibilities was a waste of time. The court also acknowledged how the investigating agency, the CBI, the highest of the field, failed to investigate other possible angles or motives of the crimes. There was talk about the prospect of the children and young women being abducted, killed, and butchered for the purpose of selling their organs. This specific possible involvement, which may have included the defendants or a criminal organization operating without them, was brought up by the Union Ministry of Women and Child Development. Although this potential direction was recommended for law enforcement to pursue, they chose not to. In the judge's own words, they stated that and I quote, Nithari killings is nothing short of a betrayal of public trust by responsible agencies. Every step of the investigation was messed up and tainted, from the initial probing to failing to follow any guidance or proper procedure and collecting evidence. The court believed that the investigators took the easy way out by finding a scapegoat for the murders and painting him as a monster. They held that the prosecution failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the accused were guilty based on only circumstantial evidence. Ashok Kumar lost his 5-year-old little boy in the Nithari killings. When he heard that the monsters who took his child were now free, he expressed how he no longer held any belief that justice would be served. Papu Lal was horrified and in shock as he watched on television the acquittal of the 2 men whom he believed had murdered his 8-year-old daughter. Durga Prasad lost his 7-year-old little girl to the killers. The government also attempted to buy his silence by giving him a house, which he has lived in all of these years. It is not only the loved ones of the victims who have suffered immeasurably, but the loved ones of the offenders have too. The family of Surinder Kohli's brother, Surendra, suffered immensely from the crimes his brother, Surinder, has been accused of. When his brother Kohli was arrested for the murders, he and his family were thrown out on the streets in the dead of winter. All of their possessions, even his kids' toys, were tossed out like trash. For the last 17 years, he has walked around the village, which was once welcome and kind, as if he were guilty of the murders himself. People threw stones at him, called him vicious names like child eater, and threatened to kill him. For the first several years, he refrained from cooking with garlic and onions, out of the fear that others may believe that he and his family were cooking children. Surendra talked about how vehicles even attempted to hit him as he walked along the streets. Now, whether you believe Surinder Kohli was guilty of these horrifying crimes or not, it doesn't justify treating his kin like this. When crimes like this happen, it is easy to not care or worry about how it affects the family and loved ones of the offender. But they are victims too. They are often villainized in the media themselves, or people attempt to blame them for their family members' atrocious behavior. It is disgusting that people treated Kohli's family this way, as if they were guilty by association. But humankind has a tendency to lump people all together. Despite the acquittal of both prisoners by the Allahabad High Court, the CBI is still hell-bent on making sure these 2 men pay. They believe without a doubt that they were the perpetrators of these heinous crimes, and they will be challenging the court's decision in the Supreme Court of India. This case is very bizarre and unsettling because the truth is not apparent. Were these monstrous evil men set free, or were these men victims themselves? So many issues and questions lead to a lack of transparency. The autopsy report addressed how the bodies of the victims were cut up with butcher-like precision. But not just anyone can slice up body parts that expertly. So how did that affect the evidence, I wonder? Was Surinder Kohli in charge of cutting up animals, or did his boss have experience? If neither one of them did, could this have been a potential clue as to who was really behind the dismemberment and thus the murders? Or was this just ignored so Surinder Kohli fit their suspect profile better? What evidence, if any, was found in the House of Horrors? Was there blood spatter, bits of remains, bones, or items of the missing children anywhere? What besides their proximity to the sewer linked them to the abduction and the murders? Yes, there was Surinder Kohli's confession, but as we are fully aware, confessions don't equate to truths in criminal law. There are countless examples of wrongful convictions made through torture, abuse, and manipulation, just like the case of Ronald Kitchen, whom I covered in episode 20. What doesn't make sense to me is if Surinder Kohli was not involved in the murders, at least in some capacity, how did he know where to direct the police to find the missing victims' remains? He led them directly to 30 more bones near his employer's house. That is not a coincidence. This indicates that at the very least, he was an eyewitness to these crimes. How could the high courts act as if he was completely innocent of any wrongdoing when he knew exactly where to find the children's remains? I don't understand how the court can claim that there is no evidence outside of Surinder Kohli's confession when this information directly aided in the discovery of more evidence. Something does not sit right with me in this case. Is this a case of corruption? Were threats made? Were Surinder Kohli and Pandey part of a criminal organization that had the power to make 12 death sentences on Kohli alone just go away? If that were the case, they would not have waited 14 years to acquit them. Were there changing hands of power during this time that took longer than expected to set these men free? All I know is that justice has not been served. The parents and loved ones of the missing and murdered children and young women will never have any closure or peace, believing that the evil men that killed their children are free now to live their lives. If they are somehow innocent of these crimes, that is even worse, as that means that the true perpetrators have been free this entire time to potentially abduct, murder, and dismember other innocents. These horrific murders have harmed every element of Nithari Village and its surrounding areas. Many people who live there today were loved ones of the victims. Others are there hoping to make new lives for themselves as the migrants did before them. But they feel stagnant and suffocated by its sinister history. Many have expressed the desire to tear the house of horrors down or sell it to a new owner, so that one day what happened there may be put behind the community and begin to heal. A stigma, a dark cloud, a never-ending evil pervades the area where the House of Horrors, Bungalow D5, Koti, still stands. The house can be sold or demolished, but it doesn't erase what happened to the victims of Nithari Village. This dark veil will never be lifted as long as justice has failed to be met. What are your thoughts? What do you think of the Nithari killings? Was this an open and shut case of the police found the right men who committed these atrocious crimes against the most innocent of victims, and they were set free? Or is there a possibility that there was corruption and bias at play the entire time, and the true perpetrators of these acts of evil have been walking amongst their community and their society, free to cause unimaginable harm? That is a terrifying thought. Hopefully one day we will have answers to this tragic, brutal story. Thank you so much for listening. I appreciate each and every one of you, and I'm beyond thrilled to bring you new episodes. Until next time, stay safe and watch out for shades of murder happening in the streets next door. Especially inside your own home. Shades of Murder is created, researched, written, and edited by Alita. Music courtesy of Pexabay by Ashot Danielian.